It's a great game for your average Joe. It's NES Works, episode 97. At the end of 1988, I don't think anyone really expected the NES to provide perfect renditions of contemporary arcade hits. But there's Not Quite Arcade Perfect, and then there's Cobra Command. Given the enormous disparity in power between its 1983 vintage internals and the incredible hardware that appeared in arcades in the back half of the 80s, the NES is well beyond its salad days as the home of awesome ports at this point. Honestly, the American NES market more or less missed those days altogether as it is. The NES providing a home for the best arcade conversions available on the market never really happened the way it did in Japan during Famicom's early days. But from this point on, we'll see very few classic arcade conversions on NES, meaning most interpretations of coin-op works going forward will fall into one of two categories: horribly compromised attempts to approximate games designed for vastly more powerful devices, or top-to-bottom reinventions built specifically for the console. We've already seen a few of the latter, perhaps most memorably Double Dragon, and Capcom will more or less specialize in that approach. Cobra Command does not stand with the best of Capcom's overhauls, but that same spirit definitely drives this release. Weirdly, this could be an adaptation of one of two different Data East arcade titles, a 1984 FMV-based laserdisc shooter and a 1988 horizontal shooter. What we have here is more likely meant to be a rendition of the latter, but honestly Cobra Command for NES could be seen to take massive liberties with either of the arcade titles that share its name. For what it's worth, the cutting room floor has dug up an alternate title screen graphic that suggests Data East toyed with the idea of releasing it under a different name entirely, which in turn implies they developed it with the intent of it not being an arcade port, but an original title altogether. The cutting room floor suggests this alternate title may have been included in the event of legal issues with the name Cobra Command, which cuts a little close to the Cobra terrorist organization featured in Hasbro's G.I. Joe property. And that may be the case. But I've noticed that publishers often renamed NES and Famicom releases that diverged too far from their source roots in Japan. The game we know as Bump and Jump on NES was called Buggy Popper on Famicom, but Japanese arcade goers knew the coin-op by the title Burnin' Rubber. On a similar note, Capcom's Top Secret was never to my knowledge positioned as a sequel to Commando in Japan, but the American marketing team retrofit that connection by calling the arcade game Bionic Commando. So it could be that Data East conceived Cobra Command for NES as a spiritual kin of the arcade game but not an actual port. Whatever the case, it doesn't matter because they ultimately elected not to go with that terrible alternate title, Stiffenwolf. So rather than this being about two mess and wildlife, it simply offers a more NES-flavored take on a simplistic arcade game. Think Karnov, but even more so. The original 1984 Cobra Command coin-op took the form of a shooting gallery powered by Laserdisc. The 1988 title played out as a fairly rudimentary horizontal shooter in the Darius mode, albeit slower, and with helicopters shooting down military craft instead of spaceships blowing up fish robots. Cobra Command on NES goes about as far as keeping the helicopters and the general horizontal scrolling ethos, but from that starting point it strikes out in its own direction. Data East reached back into video game history here to create a shooter that owes a tremendous debt to Bruderbund's Choplifter. Given that the NES ended up being one of the very few 1980s gaming systems never to host its own version of Choplifter, this works out pretty nicely for everyone. The Cobra Attack Chopper U command behaves a great deal like the Rescue Chopper in Choplifter, capable of maneuvering backward and forward as it changes its altitude, with a dedicated key for reversing direction that allows you to hover backward. Although the action moves more slowly than in Choplifter, you have to deal with the same swiftly moving jet fighters and helicopters while dodging fire from enemy gun emplacements. Your chopper fires its chin turret at angles that vary according to its motion at the moment of attack. And finally, completing the Choplifter connection, your chopper ventures into each stage with the mandate to rescue as many hostages as possible. Thankfully, it can survive more than a single hit from enemy fire. The slightest collision with the scenery, an enemy ship, or a missile will destroy your Cobra, but you can soak up a few bullets or tiny rockets before your chopper begins to spew flames and struggle to stay aloft. This might sound like a huge advantage, but Cobra Command also recreates the extreme difficulty level of Choplifter. The game has no forgiveness and no tolerance for sloppy play, and that makes for an unbelievably demanding experience. You have 5 chances per credit to complete a stage, and every level consists of a huge, sprawling enemy base packed with challenges and traps. Cobra Command's world makes for a game that feels right in keeping with NES trends of 1988, an exploratory shooter. However, the unrelenting challenge level means that most players will never have the opportunity to experience the full depth of Cobra Command. Every stage consists of the Choplifter-esque overland stages in which you need to dodge enemy fire, avoid colliding with enemy aircraft, and take out ground emplacements while attempting to rescue captives. However, each stage also contains several enemy bases that consist of expansive underground spaces. Once you blow open the entrance to a base, you take your chopper underground into cramped spaces patrolled by ground vehicles, dotted with defensive weapon emplacements, and rigged with dangerous anti-chopper traps. You wouldn't think underground incursions by attack choppers would be a regular enough occurrence to necessitate structuring billion-dollar military bases around staving them off, but here we are. The underground areas contain the real meat of the Cobra Command experience. They tend to be packed with structures that hold loads of the prisoners you need to rescue. The underground spaces are where you'll find the maintenance platforms that allow you to repair and upgrade your chopper. Here, Cobra Command establishes itself as a completely different concern than Choplifter. Not only do the stages spread out in multiple directions, but your chopper can become considerably more powerful as you progress. You can modify the Cobra in 5 different categories, each one boosting your prospects of survival considerably. You can replace your simple main gun with rapid fire, dual fire, and the ever-popular spread gun. Your secondary weapon, which surprisingly doesn't have limited ammunition, can be changed out from a simple missile to a napalm-like firebomb, naval mines, wire-guided missiles, and even homing missiles. You can beef up your armor to more than double your durability, boost your speed with engine upgrades, and even speed up your rescue efficiency by replacing the rope ladder that prisoners climb to a proper rung-style ladder. You can swap these options freely, customizing your attack capabilities to match the situation. The exploration and upgrade elements don't quite make this a Metroidvania game, but as horizontal shooters go, it certainly flirts with that concept. The underground bases present compelling spaces to poke around in through 360 degrees of motion, while the customizable upgrades offer some strategic options and a satisfying sense of growth. It's just a shame that Cobra Command is so damn hard. Controlling the helicopter takes getting used to, and the unapologetic difficulty level makes for hard-earned progress that can be wiped to 0 in an instant. With slightly less antagonistic design, Cobra Commander could have been a genuine hidden gem of the NES. Instead, simply taking away the idea of limited lives and going with a Rygar-esque structure in which you have a single life and infinite consistent continues based around a handful of checkpoints would have made for a tough but I think ultimately manageable game. Instead, its brutality dooms it to be a weak B-tier game. More promising than great. You never really hear anyone talk about Cobra Command despite its interesting design and excellent graphics, and I have to assume that's because no one in the history of humanity has made it past the first stage without cheat codes. That said, I'm happy to have discovered it belatedly as part of NES Works, armed with cheat codes. What if Trivial Pursuit were Pictionary? This is a question that no one in the world had ever asked, and yet Rare Limited decided to answer it anyway for Nintendo with Anticipation. I'm not sure how Rare became the NES's multiplayer quiz dev of choice, but Anticipation takes this direction from blip to trend. After getting off to a varied start with Slalom, RC Pro-Am, and Wizards and Warriors, Rare has now produced 3 of these things in a row: Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy, and Anticipation. Will Rare be doomed to entertaining groups of preppy white people forever? We'll see, but for now, here's basically a game in which you complete Trivial Pursuit boards by solving Pictionary illustrations. 1 to 4 players can face off here against one another, and enough CPU-controlled participants to bring the competitor count to 4. This does make Anticipation an NES landmark, the system's first 4-player simultaneous game. Now, this game predates the 4-score multi-tap adapter by a couple of years, so as you might expect, 4-player competition amounts to something of a kludge. 4 people crowd around 2 controllers, with each controller supporting 2-player. When you buzz in to solve a puzzle, one person uses the D-pad and the other uses the face buttons. This is pretty inelegant, but Rare could only do so much with the tools available at the time. Play in Anticipation revolves around boards consisting of colored spaces. The first player to clear 3 boards, which you accomplish by solving puzzles of each color on all boards, wins. Now this works a lot like Trivial Pursuit, a board game that continued to sell fairly well as of 1988 after its peak popularity in the mid-1980s. You only need to collect 4 colors per board here, instead of Trivial Pursuit's 6. The mechanics of the 2 games work similarly. Every color represents a different category, and you land on colors based on a die value. You don't earn anything by solving for a color you already hold, though it does block a competitor from collecting that space. However, rather than solving trivial questions here, you're attempting to guess at the concept of a connect-the-dots illustration that the computer steadily reveals a line at a time as the clock ticks down. Once you think you can solve a puzzle, you can ring in and will need to spell out the answer within 30 seconds, similar to Jeopardy! Listen, Anticipation is not about originality. It's about Nintendo having a video board game that incorporates popular ideas without having to pay a licensing fee. Now, once you ring in, you're allowed a single input error as you spell out your answer. And in addition to the timer countdown, a die in the corner steadily counts down from 6 to 1, and the value showing on the die's face at the moment of puzzle completion determines the number of spaces the winner moves on the board. This adds an element of additional strategy. Generally, you don't want to solve when the die shows a value of 4, because that'll just land you on the same color of space you've solved for. But if you wait around for the die to tick down to 3, you give your competitors more of an opportunity to buzz in and take the space instead. Once you complete all 4 colors on the current board, you ascend to the next level, while the competition remains on their current board. Players can solve puzzles on another player's board, but they'll only earn colors for the board they currently occupy. Each board contains different categories and distinct rules. On the first board, the game provides you with both a category description and a set of blanks equal to the number of letters in the answer. On the second board, you can see the category, but not the number of letters. And finally, level 3 doesn't hint at the category or the number of letters in the answer. It's a pretty solid structure, and it plays like a legitimate board game. This is both a compliment, it's a board game, and also a complaint, in that a session can easily become bogged down as players struggle to complete a set of colors but find themselves thwarted by bad die rolls and obstructive competitors. The real shortcoming of Anticipation lies in the picture puzzles themselves. These drawings require a certain degree of mental recalibration. They have a distinct crudity to them. Not crude as in naughty, just simplistic. For example, the outline of an airplane eventually reveals a drawing rendered with the same primitive perspective seen in a child's drawing, where the wings emerge from the top and bottom of the fuselage rather than the sides. It doesn't help that the order in which the game reveals shapes doesn't necessarily make things intuitive. The cursor has a tendency to jump around between defining outlines and fussy internal details, which obscures the nature of an illustration for longer than would be the case if a human drew the image. You also need to provide an exact word or phrase, even for items for which multiple terms would be perfectly valid. Is that teacup a teacup? No, it is simply a cup. Is that very precisely rendered penny a penny? No, it is a coin. By far the most vexing category in the game is whatchamacallit, which attempts to provide a punchy joke category in the style of Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune's mashup puzzles. These don't work at all. They combine esoteric puns with frequently incomprehensible drawings. I constantly found myself dumbfounded by some of the illustrations and couldn't even begin to guess at the so-called joke the creators had in mind as I watched as the die timer counted down to 1. This game is definitely more fun with a group of people rather than competing against CPU opponents. The computer, naturally, can solve puzzles with the minimum of inputs. The game has a tendency to solve inhumanly fast when it decides the players are performing too well. Of course, the group's setup only works provided no one has memorized the puzzles. As an 8-bit game, it contains a limited number of puzzles that you eventually will come to memorize with repeated play. I can't call Anticipation a classic or essential NES game, but I suppose it passed reasonably well enough to constitute a fun party for groups of unfathomably white people in 1988, especially once they were sufficiently drunk on a box of Reuniti on ice. But hey, if nothing else, at least Anticipation had another fun boogie-woogie soundtrack by Rare's music maestro, David Wise. What did Nintendo Power say? The magazine graced Cobra Command with a 4-page overview that broke down the first stage and mostly stands out for its novel presentation format. which depicts the maps and chopper blueprint as a document being held by the viewer. Anticipation, on the other hand, enjoyed the perks of first-party publication in the form of a much larger and more comprehensive magazine breakdown than it really deserved. I'm not sure the Nintendo Power Spread necessarily did a lot to sell people on the game, though, because it looked kind of horrible. Unattractive color choices, unappealing artwork, just a bad scene all around. I don't know if Anticipation just had bad luck, or if this was some sort of passive-aggressive swipe by the magazine staff over being forced to create multiple spreads for such a mundane game. Whatever the case, I do feel fairly confident in saying this did not result in a lot of conversions to sales. Next time on NES Works, all sports, all the time.